The world we live in today, with its borders, its alliances, and its lingering scars, was forged in the fire of a single morning. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a field in Central Europe. The air is cool, the mist is just beginning to lift off the grass, and the date is September the 1st, 1939. You are witnessing the exact moment when the old world died and a new, terrifying era was born. We often hear about World War II as a series of maps and arrows, a game of generals and politicians. But tonight, I promise you something different. We are going to strip away the dry statistics and walk through the smoke and the chaos to understand not just how the war started, but what it felt like to see the sky turn black with bombers for the very first time. By the end of this journey, you will understand why the invasion of Poland was not merely a military campaign, but the singular event that unleashed the greatest catastrophe in human history. To understand the tragedy of 1939, we cannot simply start with the first gunshot. We must wind the clock back 20 years to the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. It is 1919. The Great War has ended, and the map of Europe is being redrawn by the victors. Poland, a nation that had been erased from the map for 123 years, partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, is miraculously reborn. The Second Polish Republic emerges with a fierce sense of patriotism and a fragile existence. But in carving out this new nation, the treaty architects created a geopolitical nightmare. They gave Poland a strip of land known as the Polish Corridor to access the Baltic Sea, which effectively cut Germany in two, separating East Prussia from the rest of the German Reich. And right at the mouth of that corridor sat the free city of Danzig, a port city that was overwhelmingly German in population but under League of Nations administration and Polish customs control. For 20 years, this corridor was a bleeding wound in the German national psyche. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he did not just preach hatred, he preached restoration. He spoke to a humiliated nation about the injustice of Versailles, about the stolen lands, and about the need for Lebensraum, or living space, in the East. For years, the West watched as Hitler tested the waters. He rearmed the Rhineland. He absorbed Austria in the Anschluss. He dismantled Czechoslovakia, claiming he only wanted to unite ethnic Germans. European leaders, desperate to avoid another slaughter like the trenches of the First World War, chose appeasement. They hoped that if they gave the dictator what he asked for, he would eventually be satisfied. But by the spring of 1939, the wind had changed. Hitler's gaze turned firmly toward Poland. The diplomatic dance that occurred in the summer of 1939 was a frantic, high-stakes game of poker played with the lives of millions. Poland was in a precarious position. Caught between the hammer of Nazi Germany and the anvil of the Soviet Union, the Poles knew that any concession to Hitler would mean the end of their independence. When Hitler demanded the return of Danzig and an extraterritorial highway across the Polish corridor, the Polish government said no. They knew this was not about a city or a road, it was about submission. Hitler was furious. He had expected the Poles to fold just as the Austrians and Czechs had. He ordered his generals to prepare a plan for the invasion of Poland, codenamed Fall Weiss, or Case White. But he had one major problem. If he attacked Poland, he risked a two-front war if Britain and France honored their defense treaties with Warsaw. But even more concerning to him was the reaction of Joseph Stalin in the East. Germany could not afford to fight the Western Allies and the Soviet Union simultaneously. This leads us to one of the most cynical and shocking moments in diplomatic history. In late August 1939, the world was stunned by the announcement of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Nazi Germany and Communist Russia, sworn ideological enemies who had spent years denouncing each other, suddenly signed a non-aggression treaty. On the surface, it was a promise of peace between them. But buried deep within the document was a secret protocol, a map that drew a line right through the middle of Poland. Hitler and Stalin had agreed to carve up the country between them. With the Soviet threat neutralized, Hitler's path to war was clear. He reportedly laughed when he heard the news, slapping his thigh and exclaiming that he had the world in his pocket. The tension in late August was suffocating. In Warsaw, people dug air raid trenches in the parks, hoping they would never be used. In Berlin, the machinery of war was quietly moving into position. But Hitler needed a justification, a propaganda victory to show the world that Germany was the victim, not the aggressor. This brings us to the night of August 31st, just hours before the invasion. In a sinister operation codenamed Operation Himmler, SS operatives dressed in Polish army uniforms staged a series of attacks on German border posts. The most infamous incident occurred at the radio station in Gliwice, a German town near the border. The SS men seized the microphone and broadcast a short anti-German message in Polish. To make the scene look authentic, they left behind the body of a sprawling man, Franciszek Honiak, a German citizen known for sympathizing with the Poles. He had been arrested the day before, killed by lethal injection, and shot to look like a casualty of the firefight. He was the first victim of the Second World War, a man murdered to provide a lie. The sun had not yet risen on September 1st when the silence was shattered. At 4:45 in the morning, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which was visiting Danzig on a supposed goodwill mission, swiveled its massive guns toward the Polish transit depot on the Westerplatte Peninsula. The first shells screamed through the morning mist, slamming into the Polish fortifications. The world held its breath. The Second World War had begun. But the horror was not limited to the coast. Minutes before the naval bombardment, the Luftwaffe launched a terror raid on the sleeping town of Weilen, located near the border. Weilen had no military value. There were no factories, no troop concentrations, only sleeping civilians. The German dive bombers, the dreaded Stukas with their screaming Jericho trumpets, dropped ton after ton of high explosives. They destroyed the hospital first, despite the large red cross painted on the roof. By the time the sun came up, 70% of the town was rubble, and over 1,000 civilians were dead. It was a statement of intent. This would not be a war of chivalry. It would be a war of annihilation, or what the Germans called Vernichtungskrieg. As dawn broke across the 1,600-mile border, the full scale of the German offensive became clear. 1.5 million German soldiers surged across the frontier. They did not come on foot and horseback as armies had in the past. They came in steel columns. This was the debut of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The concept was terrifyingly simple and effective. Instead of spreading forces out along a trench line, the Germans concentrated their tanks, the panzers, into narrow spearheads. These armored fists would punch a hole through the enemy lines, supported by overwhelming air power. Once through, they would race deep into the rear, cutting off supplies, destroying communications, and spreading panic, while the infantry followed behind to mop up the surrounded defenders. The Polish army was not the backward force often depicted in myths. The story of Polish cavalry charging German tanks with lances is largely a fabrication of German propaganda meant to portray the Poles as foolishly brave but primitive. In reality, the Polish cavalry were elite mobile infantry who used horses for transport but fought on foot with anti-tank rifles and artillery. They fought with immense courage and skill. On that first day, at the Battle of Mokra, the Volhynian Cavalry Brigade destroyed over 50 German tanks and armored vehicles, holding off a superior force for an entire day. But courage alone cannot stop a tidal wave of steel. The Poles were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Their defensive strategy was flawed from the start. Politically, they felt they had to defend the entire length of their border to show the world they were fighting for every inch of sacred soil. Militarily, this was suicide. It spread their forces too thin, leaving them vulnerable to being flanked and encircled by the swift German pincers. In the air, the situation was desperate. The Polish pilots were among the best in the world, skilled and tenacious. But their planes, the P.11 fighters, were obsolete compared to the modern German Messerschmitts. Despite the technological gap, the Poles fought ferociously, inflicting heavy losses on the Luftwaffe in the opening days. But the sheer number of German planes, combined with the destruction of Polish airfields and the severing of command networks, meant that the Luftwaffe soon achieved air superiority. They roamed the skies at will, bombing troop columns, strafing refugees, and terrorizing cities. By September 3, the situation looked bleak, but a flicker of hope appeared. Britain and France, honoring their treaty obligations, declared war on Germany. In Warsaw, crowds gathered outside the British and French embassies, cheering and singing their national anthems. They believed the cavalry was coming. They believed the might of the British Empire and the French army, considered the strongest in Europe, would smash into Germany's western border while Hitler was distracted in the east. But the cheering was premature. What followed in the west was shameful. It was the beginning of the phony war. While Poland bled, the French army advanced a few miles into the Saarland, occupied a few empty villages, and then stopped. The Royal Air Force dropped propaganda leaflets over Germany instead of bombs. The Western Allies were haunted by the memories of World War I and terrified of provoking a massive German retaliation. They decided to wait, to build up their strength, leaving Poland to fight alone against the full might of the Wehrmacht. Back on the front lines, the Polish defense was cracking. The German pincers were closing in. The Army of Pomerania in the north and the Army of Lodz in the center were being shattered. The Polish commander-in-chief, Marshal Edward Rydz Smigli, ordered a general retreat to the line of the Vistula and San rivers. But retreat under the pressure of Blitzkrieg is a nightmare. Roads were clogged with terrified refugees fleeing east, mixing with retreating military units. German Stukas screamed down, strafing the congested roads, turning them into rivers of fire and blood. The chaos was absolute. Communication lines were cut by saboteurs and bombing, commanders lost contact with their units fought in isolation, unaware of where the enemy was until the tanks appeared on the horizon. Yet, amidst the collapse, there were moments of incredible heroism and tactical brilliance. Around September 9, the Polish armies attempting to retreat from western Poland saw an opportunity. Under the command of General Tadeusz Kutrzyba, they launched a surprise counterattack against the flank of the German 8th Army advancing toward Warsaw. This was the Battle of the Bzura, the largest battle of the campaign. For a few glorious days, the Poles pushed the Germans back, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing the Wehrmacht to divert tanks and aircraft from the siege of Warsaw. It was a desperate, bloody brawl fought in the marshes and villages west of the capital. But the Germans quickly regrouped. They turned the full fury of their air power and armor onto the Polish pocket. By September 19, the Battle of the Bzura was over, the Polish forces crushed, and the survivors captured. By the second week of September, the German armies were closing in on Warsaw. The Polish government had evacuated the capital, moving toward the Romanian border to establish a final defensive redoubt. They hoped to hold out in the rough terrain of the southeast until the Western Allies launched their promised offensive. It was a slim hope, but it was all they had. Then came the final blow. The stab in the back. On the morning of September 17, the Polish ambassador in Moscow was summoned at 3 a.m. He was read a note declaring that the Polish state had effectively ceased to exist and that the Soviet Union was entering the territory to protect its blood brothers, the Ukrainians and Belarusians living in eastern Poland. It was a lie. Stalin was coming to claim his share of the loot agreed upon in the secret pact with Hitler. Over 800,000 Soviet troops poured across Poland's eastern border. The Polish defenders, already exhausted and fighting with their backs to the wall against the Germans, were stunned. Many units didn't know if the Soviets were coming as friends or foes. The order went out from the high command: do not fight the Bolsheviks unless attacked or they attempt to disarm you. But the result was confusion and tragedy. The hope of a Romanian bridgehead defense evaporated instantly. Poland was now being strangled from both sides. The brutality of the Soviet invasion rivaled that of the Nazis. Polish officers were rounded up, arrested, and shipped off to camps in the east, a road that would lead thousands of them to the execution pits of Katyn Forest a few months later. The Soviets tore down Polish flags, arrested intellectuals, and began the systematic dismantling of the Polish state structure in the east. With the Soviet entry, the regular war was effectively lost. But the fighting did not stop. Warsaw, the heart of the nation, refused to surrender. Under the leadership of its mayor, Stefan Starzyński, the city transformed into a fortress. Starzyński, a civilian, became the soul of the resistance. He refused to leave his city. Day after day, his voice crackled over the radio, broadcasting amidst the falling bombs, rallying the soldiers and civilians. He organized volunteer battalions to dig anti-tank ditches and barricades. The siege of Warsaw was a glimpse into the future of urban warfare. The Germans, frustrated by the city's defiance, decided to bomb it into submission. On September 25, known as Black Monday, the Luftwaffe flew over 1,000 sorties against the capital. They dropped incendiary bombs, turning whole districts into infernos. The water mains were shattered, so there was no water to fight the fires. The hospitals were overflowing, surgeries performed by candlelight without anesthetic. The city was dying. On September 27, with food, water, and ammunition exhausted, and civilians dying by the thousands, Warsaw capitulated. It was a moment of profound grief. General Julius Rommel, commanding the defense, signed the surrender to avoid the total annihilation of the population. But even then, pockets of resistance fought on. On the Hel Peninsula, overlooking the Baltic, a garrison of naval troops held out in fortified bunkers until October 2, repelling wave after wave of German attacks. And near the town of Koch, General Franciszek Kleeberg's independent operational group Polsy fought the last major battle of the campaign, not surrendering until October 6, and only then because they had run out of bullets. As the guns finally fell silent in early October, Poland lay in ruins. The cost was staggering. Over 66,000 Polish soldiers were dead, and nearly 700,000 were taken prisoner by the Germans. The Soviets captured another 250,000. But the civilian toll was the true harbinger of the genocide to come. Tens of thousands of civilians had been murdered in air raids and summary executions. The occupation that followed was unlike anything modern Europe had ever seen. Germany and the Soviet Union formally divided the country. Western Poland was annexed directly into the German Reich. Central Poland became the general government, a colony for exploitation and racial engineering run by the ruthless Hans Frank. Eastern Poland was absorbed into the Soviet republics. The Germans immediately began a campaign to decapitate Polish society. This was the intelligence action. They hunted down professors, priests, politicians, and community leaders. If you were educated, if you were a patriot, if you were a leader, you were a target. Thousands were shot in forests or sent to the newly constructed concentration camps. It was a deliberate attempt to turn the Polish people into a nation of serfs, stripped of their culture and identity. Meanwhile, the Jewish population of Poland, the largest in Europe, found themselves trapped in a living hell. Almost immediately, Jews were forced into ghettos, stripped of their rights, their property, and their dignity. The invasion of Poland was the opening chapter of the Holocaust. The yellow stars, the forced labor, the starvation, it all began here, in the autumn of 1939. But amidst this total darkness, a flame remained. The Polish government did not surrender. They escaped to France, and later to London, maintaining the legal continuity of the Polish state. The Polish Navy, or what was left of it, sailed to Britain to fight alongside the Royal Navy. Polish airmen would soon become legends in the Battle of Britain. And back home, in the occupied cities and forests, the Polish underground state began to form. It would become the largest and most sophisticated resistance movement in occupied Europe. They printed secret newspapers, ran secret schools to teach Polish history forbidden by the Nazis, and gathered intelligence that would prove vital to the Allied cause. The invasion of Poland was a military defeat, but it was not the end of the Polish nation. It was the beginning of a 5-year struggle that would test the limits of human endurance. So, why does this story matter to us tonight? Why should we, sitting in the comfort of our modern lives, look back at those dark days in September? Because the invasion of Poland teaches us a lesson that we forget at our peril. It teaches us that peace is fragile. It teaches us that authoritarianism, when left unchecked, does not stop at its own borders. It shows us that the calculations of great powers often ignore the suffering of ordinary people. But most importantly, it reveals the resilience of the human spirit. When we look at the black and white footage of Stukas diving and tanks rolling, we must remember that those were real people running for cover. The mother shielding her child in a ditch near Wilan, the cavalry officer charging into the smoke at Mokra, the mayor of Warsaw speaking truth to power over the radio while the walls crumbled around him, they were real. The Second World War did not start with a grand battle between equal powers. It started with a crime. It started with the bullying of a smaller nation by two totalitarian giants. It started with the world closing its eyes, hoping the storm would pass. But the storm did not pass. It engulfed the world. And it all began on that misty morning in September, when the first shell struck the Westerplatte, and the world changed forever. As you lay your head down tonight, remember that silence is a luxury. The silence that fell over Poland in October 1939 was the silence of the graveyard, but it was also the silence of a seed buried in the earth, waiting for the spring that would take 5 long, bloody years to arrive. This was the invasion of Poland. This was the beginning of the end of the old world. And now, you know not just what happened, but what it meant. The guns fell silent in October 1939, but the silence was deceptive. It was the silence of a held breath, the terrifying pause before the plunge. While the world watched and waited, wondering if this was the end of the conflict, the people of Poland were learning the brutal reality of their new existence. The country had vanished from the map, wiped away by the stroke of a pen in Berlin and Moscow, but the nation, the spirit, the culture, the defiance, went nowhere. It simply changed its shape. It went underground, into the shadows, into the forests, and into the hearts of millions who refused to accept the verdict of the battlefield. To understand the full scope of how the invasion of Poland ignited the Second World War, we must look at what happened in that terrible winter of 1939 and 1940. It was one of the coldest winters in living memory. In the ruined streets of Warsaw, people huddled in cellars, burning furniture and books to keep from freezing. But the cold was the least of their worries. In the western half of the country, annexed by Germany, the Nazis began a project of racial engineering that makes the blood run cold. They didn't just want the land, they wanted to erase the memory of who had lived there. A massive program of expulsion began. Hundreds of thousands of Poles were thrown out of their homes in the annexed territories, places like Poznan and Silesia, to make room for German settlers brought in from the Baltics and the East. Imagine waking up to a banging on your door at 4 in the morning. You are given 20 minutes to pack a single suitcase. You leave your house, your furniture, your family photos, your entire life behind. You are herded onto cattle trucks and dumped in the central part of Poland, the general government, often with nothing but the clothes on your back. This general government, ruled by Hans Frank from the Wawel Castle in Krakow, the ancient seat of Polish kings, became a laboratory of horror. Frank was a man of cultured tastes who played Chopin on the piano by night and signed death warrants by day. He famously said, "If I had to put up a poster for every 7 Poles shot, the forests of Poland would not be sufficient to manufacture the paper." The streets became theaters of terror. The Germans introduced the Lepanka, or the roundup. Soldiers would cordon off a city street or a tram stop at random, arresting everyone caught inside. Men, women, teenagers, it didn't matter. They were hauled off to prisons like the infamous Pojak in Warsaw, or sent straight to forced labor in the Reich. You could leave your house to buy bread and never return. But if the German occupation was a systematic machine of cruelty, the Soviet occupation in the East was a chaotic nightmare of class warfare. When the Red Army marched in, they didn't just bring tanks, they brought a revolution at the barrel of a gun. They turned the social order upside down. If you owned a shop, if you were a landowner, a policeman, a forester, or even a postman, you were branded an enemy of the people. The Soviets wanted to decapitate society just as much as the Germans did. In the dead of night, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, came knocking. They organized 4 massive waves of deportations. Freight trains, the kind used to transport coal or cattle, were lined up at railway stations across eastern Poland. Entire families were packed into these freezing boxcars, 60 or 70 people to a car, with no windows, a hole in the floor for sanitation, and little to no water. They were sent on a journey that lasted weeks, rolling endlessly east into the vast emptiness of Siberia and the steppes of Kazakhstan. Over 1 million Polish citizens were deported to the gulags. Many were children. A staggering number of them never returned, their bodies left in unmarked graves in the permafrost, victims of a war the world had seemingly forgotten. And yet, in the midst of this dual apocalypse, something extraordinary was happening. The Polish state was regenerating. It was known as the Polskie Państwo Podziemne, the Polish underground state. This was not just a group of partisans hiding in the woods with rifles, it was a fully functioning government operating in secret, right under the noses of the Gestapo. It had its own courts, passing verdicts on traitors and collaborators. It had its own schools and universities. Since the Germans had banned education for Poles beyond a basic elementary level, thousands of students attended secret classes in private apartments, risking death to learn history, literature, and mathematics. It even had a welfare system to help the families of the imprisoned. The military arm of this underground eventually became the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army. By the war's end, it would number nearly 400,000 sworn soldiers, the largest underground army in occupied Europe. They were everywhere. The waiter serving a German officer coffee might be an intelligence officer. The woman selling flowers on the corner might be a courier carrying microfilm in her basket. They practiced a philosophy of silent warfare, sabotage, intelligence gathering, and preparation for a general uprising. But while Poland suffered in the dark, the war in the West had settled into a bizarre stalemate. The French and British troops sat behind the Maginot Line, looking across the border at the Germans, who looked right back. The press called it the phony war, or the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. It was a surreal time. In Paris and London, life went on almost as normal. Theaters were open, restaurants were full. There was a dangerous illusion that perhaps the war could be contained, that Hitler had taken his prize in the East and would go no further. This illusion was shattered in the spring of 1940. And ironically, the catalyst was once again the Polish spirit, refusing to die. Thousands of Polish soldiers who had escaped the collapse in September 1939 had not gone home. They had trekked across the Carpathian Mountains into Romania and Hungary. They were interned in camps, but they escaped by the thousands, slipping away in civilian clothes, traveling on forged passports. They were known as Sikorski's tourists, named after General Władysław Sikorski, the new prime minister of the Polish government in exile in France. They traveled across a hostile continent, driven by a single burning obsession, to fight the Germans again. They converged on France, where the Polish army was reborn. By the spring of 1940, over 80,000 Polish soldiers were ready for battle on French soil. When Hitler finally ended the phony war on May 10, 1940, unleashing his Blitzkrieg against France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the shock was absolute. The Western Allies, who had stood by while Poland fell, now found themselves facing the same terrifying tactics. The Stukas screamed over the French countryside. The panzers sliced through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the Maginot Line and trapping the Allied armies against the sea. The Polish divisions in France fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. They defended the Maginot Line even after the French units on their flanks had surrendered. At the Battle of La Garde, the Polish 1st Grenadier Division held off superior German forces for 2 days, buying time for the retreat. But the collapse of France was inevitable. It took Germany just 6 weeks to conquer the nation that was supposed to have the finest army in Europe. The lesson was bitter, the strategy of containment had failed. The war that started in Poland could not be ignored. As France fell, the chaos of evacuation began. We all know the story of Dunkirk, the miraculous rescue of the British Expeditionary Force. But fewer know about the frantic evacuation of the Polish forces. About 20,000 Polish soldiers made it to Britain in June 1940. They arrived exhausted, demoralized, and speaking no English. To many in the British command, they were seen as a defeated force, remnants of a country that had collapsed in weeks. They were given unmatched uniforms and stationed in tents in Scotland to guard the coast against an invasion that everyone felt was imminent. But the Battle of Britain would change everything. In the summer of 1940, the fate of the free world hung by a thread. Hitler's plan was to destroy the Royal Air Force to pave the way for an invasion of England, Operation Sea Lion. The Luftwaffe outnumbered the RAF heavily. British pilots were falling from exhaustion, flying sortie after sortie, dying at a rate that the training schools couldn't replace. The British needed every pilot they could get. Reluctantly, the RAF allowed the Polish pilots to form their own squadrons. The British commanders were skeptical. They thought the Poles were undisciplined, reckless, and difficult to communicate with. But on August 30, 1940, during a training flight, a Polish pilot named Ludwik Paszkiewicz saw a formation of German bombers. Disobeying orders to stay in formation, he peeled off, attacked, and shot down a German plane. His commander was furious, but the result was undeniable. The Poles were ready. The devastating effectiveness of the Polish 303 Squadron is the stuff of legend. These men had seen their cities burn. They weren't fighting for territory, they were fighting for revenge. They flew their Hurricanes closer to the German bombers than anyone else dared, opening fire at point-blank range to ensure a kill. In the course of the Battle of Britain, the 303 Squadron claimed the highest number of kills of any squadron in the RAF. The British public, who had initially viewed these strangers with suspicion, now hailed them as heroes. In the pubs of London, Poland became a toast. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding later admitted, had it not been for the magnificent material contributed by the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the battle would have been the same. So, within a year of the invasion of their homeland, the Poles had not only refused to surrender but had played a decisive role in saving Britain, the last fortress of democracy in Europe. But while the skies over England were filled with dogfights, a much darker chapter was unfolding in the east, one that would haunt the alliance for decades. Remember the Soviet invasion? In the spring of 1940, the families of the captured Polish officers ceased receiving letters. Silence fell over the prisoner-of-war camps in Kozulsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. The Polish government in London asked Stalin repeatedly, "Where are our officers? We have lists of thousands of men, generals, professors, doctors, engineers, who have simply vanished." Stalin offered vague, cryptic answers. He said they had escaped to Manchuria. He said he didn't know. The truth lay buried under the pine trees of the Katyn forest, near Smolensk in Russia. In April and May of 1940, on Stalin's direct orders, the NKVD had systematically executed 22,000 Polish officers and intelligentsia. They were taken to the woods, their hands tied behind their backs with wire, and shot in the back of the head, one by one. It was a cold-blooded attempt to wipe out the leadership class of the Polish nation so that it could never rise again. This crime, the Katyn massacre, remained a secret for 3 years. But it was a ticking time bomb in the heart of the Grand Alliance. When Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the geopolitical board flipped again. Suddenly, the Soviet Union was an ally of Britain and the Polish government in exile. The Poles found themselves in the impossible position of having to ally with the very power that had stabbed them in the back 2 years earlier. General Sikorski, pragmatic and desperate to liberate the hundreds of thousands of Poles suffering in the gulags, signed a treaty with Stalin. An amnesty was declared. The gates of the Soviet labor camps were thrown open. A new Polish army was formed on Soviet soil, made up of scarecrows, men and women who had been starved and worked to the bone in the Siberian mines. They were led by General Władysław Anders, a man who had emerged from a Soviet prison cell, battered but unbroken. This Anders army began an exodus that is almost biblical in scale. Civilians, orphans, and soldiers traveled thousands of miles south, out of the Soviet Union, through Iran, Iraq, and Palestine. They would eventually fight their way up the spine of Italy, capturing the impregnable monastery of Monte Cassino in 1944. But as they marched, they carried with them the heavy silence of the missing officers. Where were they? The question hung over every diplomatic meeting between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. The invasion of Poland in 1939 had set in motion a chain of events that had now engulfed the entire globe. By 1941, the war was no longer just about the Polish corridor or Danzig. It was a global conflagration involving the United States, Japan, China, and the colonial empires. Yet, Poland remained the conscience of the war. It was the first to fight, the country that had said no when everyone else said maybe. The resistance inside Poland continued to grow, becoming more sophisticated. They weren't just blowing up trains now. They were intelligence masters. It was the Polish resistance that captured a V-2 rocket, Hitler's wonder weapon, dismantled it, and smuggled the parts to Britain, allowing the Allies to understand the new threat. It was Polish mathematicians who had cracked the early Enigma codes before the war even started, giving the British at Bletchley Park the head start they needed to break the German naval ciphers. But the tragedy of Poland was that its fate was increasingly being decided not by its own soldiers, but by the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, in conference rooms in Tehran and Yalta. As the Soviet Red Army began to push the Germans back in 1943 and 44, it became clear that Poland would be liberated by the Soviet Union. For the Poles, this was not liberation, it was a change of jailers. The climax of this tragedy came in August 1944 with the Warsaw Uprising. This is crucial to understand, and it is often confused with the Ghetto Uprising of 1943. The Warsaw Uprising of 44 was a massive, citywide rebellion by the Polish Home Army. As the Soviet tanks reached the eastern bank of the Vistula River, just across from Warsaw, the Polish underground decided the time had come. They wanted to liberate their own capital before the Russians arrived, to welcome the Soviets as hosts, not as subjects. On August 1, 1944, at WWII, 50,000 poorly armed insurgents rose up against the German garrison. For 63 days, the people of Warsaw fought with a heroism that defies description. They fought in the sewers, in the ruins, floor by floor, room by room. But the Red Army stopped. They stopped right across the river. Stalin ordered his tanks to halt. He refused to allow Allied planes to land on Soviet airfields to drop supplies to the insurgents. He folded his arms and watched as the Germans systematically destroyed the Polish resistance. It was a cynical, calculated move to let the Nazis do the dirty work of killing the Polish patriots who might oppose Soviet rule after the war. When the uprising finally collapsed in October 1944, Hitler ordered Warsaw to be erased from the earth. Not just defeated, but destroyed. German demolition squads went street by street, dynamiting libraries, palaces, churches, and monuments. When the Soviets finally entered the city in January 1945, they found a lunar landscape. 85% of the city was gone. It was a city of graves. The war ended in May 1945. Crowds celebrated in London, Paris, and New York. Sailors kissed nurses in Times Square. But for Poland, there was no Victory Day parade. The soldiers who had fought in the Battle of Britain, who had taken Monte Cassino, who had bled in Normandy with the 1st Armored Division, were not invited to the Victory March in London for fear of offending Stalin. Poland had been betrayed. The country was shifted west on the map, losing its eastern territories to the Soviet Union and gaining German lands in the west. It was forced behind the Iron Curtain, entering a new period of darkness that would last for 44 years. So, when we ask how World War II started, the answer is simple: it started with the invasion of Poland. But when we ask, how did it end, the answer is much more complex. For Poland, the war that began on September 1, 1939, didn't truly end until 1989, when the Iron Curtain finally fell and the nation regained the sovereignty it had fought for with such desperate courage. The legacy of 1939 is all around us. The borders of modern Europe, the concepts of crimes against humanity, the very way we understand the fight between tyranny and freedom, it was all forged in the fires of that September campaign. When you walk through the rebuilt old town of Warsaw today, you are walking through a miracle. Every brick was laid by a people who refused to be erased. The invasion was meant to be the end of Poland. Instead, it became the crucible that proved that a nation is not defined by its borders, but by the will of its people to exist. This is the story of the invasion of Poland. It is a story of ultimate tragedy, but also of ultimate triumph. It reminds us that even when the sky turns black with bombers, and the world turns its back, the human spirit can endure, can fight, and eventually, can win. Thank you for walking this dark, yet necessary path with me tonight.